You're scrolling through social media, you see fellow authors and authors you don't know posting that they have made a bestseller list. Their book has released and they are number one in their category. And you think to yourself, wow, now there is a successful author. But what does that really mean? And what are the numbers that are hidden behind book sales? How many copies do you actually need to sell to be perceived as a successful author? Well, in today's episode, I'll be going over book numbers and how many books do authors actually need to sell to be successful. And it's not what you think. So stay tuned. This is Your Path to Publish. I'm your host, Zach Christensen. For the past decade, our team has guided authors just like you to find the best path to publish your book, get people excited to buy it even before it launches, and to turn it into the ultimate business card to build your business and your legacy. If you are ready to get your book out of your head and into people's hands, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. I was once introduced to a book, a very small book, 144 pages, that's called How to Lie with Statistics. It's a very easy read, very simple, and I think everyone needs to read this book. Why? Because it tells you how to accurately interpret the data you're reading. Now, I'm not talking about going into statistics and figuring out the standard deviation, looking at a bell curve and how all of that works. I'm talking about the numbers that you see every day and knowing how to understand that data and use it to make better decisions and to set, for you as an author, better expectations. Personally, I first started seeing the power of understanding this as I looked at graduate schools that I wanted to go to. I got on a site for organizational psychology degrees, and it gave a wonderful list of all the schools, stats around the schools, and it showed, on average, the acceptance rate for these schools. It was very valuable. Now, what was interesting to see as I teased out the data that some schools had lower acceptance rates, some had higher acceptance rates. Now, what was interesting behind that data was you looked at the number of students that applied and the number that were accepted. I would say on average, most master's degree programs in my field were accepting between 20 and 30 students. Then there were other schools that were taking around 100 to 120 students every year. So that upped their acceptance rate. Where others that were more deliberate or limited to how many students they would take, the 20 to 30 range, had a lower percentage of acceptance. Now, I'm not saying either of those is good or bad. It just depends on the trade-offs that you're looking at with each of those options and the kind of experience that you want to have. I mention this deliberately for all you authors listening because there are so many different stats out there on book sales. And your data is only good as the data of what you can have access to and what you can measure. And so some of the stats out there are limited and maybe limited for your genre, and you may be lumped in with other books, other categories, and other genres that don't accurately reflect what your book can do in the marketplace. So let's jump into this a little bit more. If we were to look at this at a high level, and I've been looking at a lot of different stats from a lot of different places, it would suggest that the average, okay, keep in mind the average of books out there only sells about 250 copies in its lifetime. Other stats I've looked at say that's true for self-published books, where on the other hand, the average traditionally published books sells 3,000 copies over its lifetime. And when you consider the duration of those sales, only a fraction, maybe 200 of those 3,000 copies are sold in the first year. So what really does make a book a successful bestseller? Well, let's look into some other stats. I do like stats because I believe it tells a story, and I want you to think about what story is this telling for you as the author. So BookScan, which counts books sold, retail books sold, has counted that in 2023, there was about 767 million print books sold. Now, they account probably around 80 to 85% of the marketplace. So if you up that and you throw in ebooks and audiobooks into the mix, you're probably looking at over 1 billion books sold every year. And that's retail sales that are tracked. Not all the sales are tracked. So that's the first thing to look at was what's being tracked. So those are all retail sales. So it's not counting all the sales that authors necessarily do on their own that are sold directly from the publisher to like an event or a company for the author. Now going back to stats for a minute, the average is taking into account all the mega best-selling books, the top 1%, and taking in the bottom 1% that are selling a few copies versus several tens of thousands of copies every year. So you're getting a very skewed report. I always look for the median. Now, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of median sales out there that I could find that seemed accurate. But as you dive in deeper, you're going to be able to estimate how many sales you can expect for your book. So how does this differ by industry? Generally speaking, and you can look up the specific stats and averages for this, is that fiction books are going to sell more than nonfiction books in many ways, because a lot of fiction books might include children's books. And so it's important to then drill down into the categories of each of those books. Now, because I mostly work with nonfiction authors, I'm going to dive into the nonfiction book sales statistics a little bit. So looking at Words Rated, and you can Google this and find it, and I'll include it in the show notes, is that nonfiction is broken down into 3 main categories: adult nonfiction, juvenile nonfiction, and young adult nonfiction. Adult nonfiction in 2022 sold 289 million copies. Juvenile was 66 million copies, and young adult nonfiction was about 4.1 million copies. So looking at that, you can start to see, okay, there's a good amount of those sold each year. And then that breaks down further into the types of nonfiction book sales by those categories. So that breaks down into memoirs, self-help books, and business books, and cookbook sales. You can really geek out over these sales, and Words Rated does go into each of those categories in depth. So I would encourage you to go there and look at the size of your industry. Because if you can look at the size of your industry for yearly sales on average, then you can say, okay, the average book in that category is $20. So take that amount divided by $20. And I know I'm using averages, and take your whole industry sales for that year and then divide it by the estimated number of books that are published that year. And then that might give you a good average or baseline of books that you can reach for as your goal. But don't use that as an indicator about the potential for your book. What does it mean to be successful as an author and to consider your book to be successful? So I want to jump into what counts as a sale. So you have paperback and hardcover, basically print formats. You have ebook and audiobook sales. Now, consider those. And then what is a direct sale, an indirect sale, but also a retail sale? A retail sale is an easy one. It's sold through a third-party platform such as Books A Million, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. A direct sale, I would say, is something that's directly related to where the author is selling the book direct to the company or consumer. And those sales typically do not get counted in the data. A publisher might count it, but it's not going to be counted by BookScan. And then there's an indirect sale. Now, this is similar to some aspects of direct sales, so let me give you an example. Companies who have a book associated with their content will often include the book in a kit for their training. So if you're a manager and you go to a training, you'll get a participant guide, pens, paper, notes, some other items, and a book that's associated with that training. So you're not necessarily selling the book, but it's a part of a kit that the author or company is selling. For you as an author, as you're thinking about how do I estimate how many books that I could sell, that really comes down to what are the types of sales that you see happening within your network. How much of those are going to be retail sales? How much are going to be directly to clients? How much are going to be part of a package that you sell? And putting a number around what you estimate for you is what your benchmark is going to be. I would caution authors to compare themselves to already successful books in their industry because it's not realistic for your type of book necessarily. Those books can give you a great benchmark of what the market potential is, but you really want to look at sales and success of sales compared to yourself. So for most authors, I think a consensus I've come across is that depending on your platform and everything, most authors, their first week of sales will sell between maybe 200 and 400 copies a week. I've looked up those published stats from companies who do help authors as more of hybrid publishers. And so that's your benchmark. So what are you going to do from there to grow your sales? Now, after your launch week, your sales will most likely go down. But what can you do to sell those consistently over time? And I want you to listen to this carefully. I believe that book sales are not a good way to measure the success of a nonfiction book. Why? Because you're going to be getting so much more from your book with your beyond the book services, such as online courses, speaking engagements, consulting and coaching, and whatever other products that you're creating from that. Your book is an enabler to increase your brand and you as an author. Bringing this all back around, honestly, there's not really a hard and fast number that you can say, if I sell 50 books, my book is a best-selling book, or it's successful. It might be. It could be for you as an author. So you need to take the time to define what success looks like for yourself. Set yourself a goal. If you want to say, I want to sell 10,000 books over my lifetime of that book, that's a successful book. If an indication of a successful book is you get an Amazon badge or New York Times or USA Today, then that can be your measure of a successful book. If you're trying to make a living off of just your book alone, you'll probably need more than one book, but then you can figure out how much revenue do you need to bring in and how much do you make per book. So to close out, I want to encourage you as authors to make sure you understand with your book sale goals that you can achieve them. It takes hard work, but don't only look at the success of your book through sales. Look at it through the impact, the life's change, and the change that it's made in you as you've written your book. There are several ways to measure success. So thanks for tuning in today and listening. I want to invite you to connect with us on our social media platforms. You can find all the platforms we're on at juxtabook.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone, share it with a fellow author friend, or someone who's looking to increase the impact of their book with their audience. And on next week's episode, I will be talking about consistency as an author and with writing your book. I'm going to put a different spin and viewpoint on what it means to be consistent. So tune in next week. And as always, if you have any questions about a recent episode that you'd like to submit, visit juxtabook.com, Your Path to Publish, and click the appropriate button to leave your question, and it will be featured on a future episode.